Today, I'm extremely pleased to have a good friend of mine and someone who sat in these seats many, is it up there? Yeah, many years ago. Carlos Menendez. Carlos Menendez was president at MasterCard. Now, I should be clear, that doesn't mean he was president of the whole company. He was just president of a big portion of the company. He's been a big supporter of the Tech Center, and I want to acknowledge Paul Bettino, our director's here today. Thanks for coming, Paul. And Carlos, I asked him back, he sat in your seats many years ago, and then he recently stepped aside from being president at MasterCard to do new endeavors. And I've asked him to kind of come and share his journey. He started exactly where you are, and he ended up, I think, at a great place and has many insights to share with you. So let's give Carlos a warm welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ricketts. Much appreciated. Actually, I usually sat up there because I was a little late and we'd be coming in to class, but they didn't have geofencing back then. They didn't have even the internet, really, in '91. It's really a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is how you do innovation in large companies. The reality is that startups have been around for a while. There's a lot of excitement in startups, but an amazing amount of innovation actually happens in large companies. And the metrics are a little bit different, the process is a little bit different, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'll answer questions throughout and or at the end, whatever you like. Please feel free to just raise your hand and speak up. Dr. Ricketts said sometimes that was done. People didn't really ask questions 30, 40 years ago, however when it was. I lose track of time. But I'm happy to answer them because I think it makes for a better presentation. So, thinking big, Carlos Menendez, Quincy House, that introduction is still the same as I understand it from the late 80s, 90s. A little bit about innovation itself. People talk about innovation as if by itself it was a good idea. But companies, when they're innovating, are looking for specific things. And I'll talk a little bit about that. How you innovate in large companies, how you get past some of the biases in large companies. It is difficult to innovate in large companies, to be clear. But there still is a lot going on. Partnerships, and particularly in this hyper-connected world, how you build partnerships across industries, how do you find new solutions for that. And then a little bit on my organization and career development. Just some of the things I've learned along the way that I'm happy to share. Every path is different, but it might work out for you. I was just talking to our friend Jordan here about some of the questions that come up as you look at summer internships and future, et cetera. And then I'll open it up for questions. I think that's pretty much what we want to cover. If you want to talk about something else, the Dolphins, the UK can do that too. So I live in London, lived there 20 plus years, still an American accent. Puerto Rican, Cuban descent, grew up in Florida. I have worked pretty much at large companies throughout my life, Procter & Gamble, Citibank, MasterCard. I did work at a law office for a little bit, domestic violence and immigration law office in DC. But that's when I decided I did not want to become a lawyer. So effectively, I've seen companies trying to innovate, and that's happened both in Latin America, in the US, and Europe. I've had global roles for almost 20 years. And so I can talk about other countries in contrast, and I think that's important because innovation no longer happens just in one place, and when it does, it is copied very quickly. There used to be a company, I think it's still around, called Rocket Industries or something like that, and specifically they look for startups that succeed in one market and then copy it as quickly as possible in another market. So when Uber came up, Grab showed up in other places, et cetera, but that also happens with large companies. So far, okay? Jordan, I thought you were going to ask a question. You're just yawning. I mean, it's okay. We'll work on that. Okay, excellent. So why do large companies want to innovate? It's really about delivering the new. And why is the new important? The rate of change in society continues to accelerate, right? As you and many companies were taken by surprise by the rise of AGI, or what we refer to as AGI, I'm not sure what the terminology here is, Harvard, generative artificial intelligence, over the last year, and people were surprised. And so the view is that we have to be innovating to develop the new. And new means new customers. This is the hardest part It's not so much new revenue. There are ways to raise revenue, but the number one reason people innovate is for new customers. And so to acquire a new customer for a bank or for a merchant is very, very expensive. And so as a benchmark, if you want to open a new checking account, which is relatively staid and boring, banks will spend anywhere from $500 to $1,000 per new customer. For a credit card, several $100. If you are like MasterCard, and I can't share too much obviously, but you're acquiring a new bank as a customer, you're going to spend millions, if not tens of millions, depending on the size. So when we at large companies, and I'll use sort of we here as in the large company sense, look at why you want to innovate, it is about finding new customers. And so if you Intuit, does anybody know Intuit? You're supposed to be filing your taxes if you have income at this age. Intuit historically has been doing TurboTax and providing tax advice, et cetera. They bought Credit Karma. I'm sure you've all heard of Credit Karma. Credit Karma has somewhere around 100 million customers, and I think they bought it for about $7 billion. And so it's really a question of how do I attract 100 million customers and another type of customer. Credit Karma tend to be younger. They tend to be earlier in their life cycle, which is where lending money actually makes money for banks. When you get older, you don't really need to borrow as much. People get nervous about lending you money when you get very old because older people pass away more quickly than younger people. And so effectively, new customers. So if there's like one thing you remember from this presentation, this is it. You're innovating for new customers. Okay. New revenue. Now, new revenue comes around, is usually more a measure of the goal. When IBM shifted to services, it was more of a defensive move. It was the fact that mainframes and computers were becoming more of a commodity, and they needed to grow revenue, so they innovated in terms of providing full service. And so services and change in innovation to deliver new revenue. But I think everybody inherently understands that they want to drive growth. This is one of the challenges that have come up with startups historically, concepts like pre-revenue. Pre-revenue is fine, I think, in certain industries when you can see a path to revenue, but the business model underneath it needs to be sound. I was around at the first dot-com crash. I don't even think they call them dot-com crashes anymore, but fintech crashes, all these tech crashes, they come and go. These cycles are part of life. And what boils down is revenue. So when you are innovating in a large company, and I bring this up later, and I tend to repeat myself as my children say, revenue, stick close to the revenue. This is where you want to be innovating in, because this is what pays dividends in terms of your career and your compensation effectively. So far, so good. New advantages. And so this is what we tend to study more in school. I have a master's in finance from UPenn, Wharton. And this is really what we talked about innovation back then, also in the 90s. But I've taught classes there recently, and you talk about, you're trying to figure out new ways to do things and new advantages. And this is important, don't get me wrong. You want to stay ahead of the curve. But part of the reason you want to stay ahead of the curve is more a function of when I get to the bottom of the page about what the market wants. The reality of the world is today that there is intense concentration of companies, right? There's Visa, there's MasterCard, there's American Express, there's China UnionPay, there's a few large companies in the payment services. There's a few large airlines. There's a few large, aluminum manufacturers, a few large cement manufacturers. There's incredible concentration. And so it is very, very hard to be disrupted by smaller companies coming into the space. But you do want to be ready, and so innovation tends to focus on perhaps where they're going to go. But they're almost what's the right word? They're almost a hedging action. And so I think it's long enough, so I can certainly talk about this at MasterCard. When the Apple phone was launched, and the ability to make payments on a phone and Google Droid and all that, for a while the view was like, credit cards are going to go away. And I did an interview at the time. I was the head of debit and credit for MasterCard, and I said cards will be around for at least 20 years, if not longer. And the reality is that these things change slowly. But the market perceived the risk. Apple's going to come in. It's going to crush the card networks. The reality of the matter is that habits are built over time in terms of payment habits in particular, which tend to be generational, which is why older people use cash and even traveler's checks, if you can believe that. The people sort of middle age use credit, Gen X, younger people use debit, and you guys move to Cash App and phone, and you will probably keep that habit for a very, very long time. So that's just the way things are. Advantages are important, but it's really about customers, revenue, and then advantages to address market conditions. And then finally, there is an outmaneuvering of the competition. So many of you might remember Nokia, maybe, or BlackBerry, which apparently is still around. I looked it up yesterday. I did not know that. And then the iPhone and such. These were iterations. Innovation drove to them. But it wasn't a straight line, and I think this is important to understand. There was like the Newton, and there was the Palm Pilot. There were many attempts to go in different paths, but the innovation did allow for the facility of addressing the market. And then finally, adapting to a changing world. Now this is actually, I think, at the core of innovation as we study, and which is the hard part. Consumer tastes and consumer abilities change. They change very slowly, sometimes very quickly. When they change quickly is when you have that disruption. And so for a long time, Netflix was sending CDs through the mail, as you know, and then they moved to streaming, and they had this incredible advantage in streaming until Disney and other companies sort of woke up and tried to get into the space. But it became really efficient, interesting for people to watch movies at home. This was a paradigm shift. This happened across all generations, and really was a time when innovation would have served people well by these large companies. Not everybody was able to make that transition. But when we talk about innovation in a company, it's really about turning the light bulb, right? It's about the perspiration, not the inspiration. It's about doing things a little different. And that is the sort of innovation that large companies focus on, which is why this adaptation to a changing world tends to catch companies by surprise, because you're just tweaking a little. David, I'm not sure, Dr. Ricketts, apologies. I'm not sure if how much background you've given them on history of the world, but Kodak invented digital photography. Hopefully that's been covered. But they sort of threw it away because they were like, no, people aren't really going to want this, and it's going to hurt our core business. But when that change happens, if a company is not ready to innovate, it really gets into trouble. And this is where the market comes to play. Markets value growth. When you're talking PDE multiples, I'm going to challenge price to earnings multiples, stock price divided by earnings, a measure of future value. This is how companies are judged in the market, how much growth they're going to deliver. And so when large companies innovate, part of it is because the expectation has risen so much in the world about being fresh, about being ready for things, that you have to innovate to drive the value of your company. It's not enough to just say you're in payments or you're in entertainment and movies. What else are you going to go to? Are you going to open theme parks? Are you going to spread around the world? And this sort of innovation that drives valuations is important because markets reward growth. TransUnion, a couple days ago, had a revenue miss. TransUnion is a credit bureau. It supplies information to Credit Karma. Their stock was down about 20%. This morning, MasterCard had a revenue miss. This is public. Last time I checked, our stock was down about $10. And so it is important to be generating that growth as a function of really generating stock growth, because PDE expansion is what builds shareholder value. This is a little hard to explain to people who aren't versed in the market, but effectively, the market PDE is something around 15. So that means you are paying for the next 15 years of earnings when you buy a stock, okay? There are some companies that you're paying 40 to 50. The growth from 15 to 40, 50 is what drives the market price, and that is what companies are looking for. So I can write something up, I can send it around if that's allowed to explain it. It can be a little boring for people who don't know it. It can be boring for people who do know it. So I didn't want to talk too much about it, but I did want to tell you that growth, that large companies are to deliver growth and to deliver PDE multiple expansion. When people buy Apple shares, which have a tremendous PDE multiple, it's not because just what they're doing today but because of the expectation of what they're going to do tomorrow. And when you build that at the core of your company, value proposition or culture, that is what keeps a high share price. And that is why companies are geared towards innovation, for that public growth. Does that sort of make sense? Not make sense? Paul, that made sense to you, right? I know your name, so I figured I'd all right. Stock price, I put it in here, but whatever. Okay, so I have my 11-year-old son here. I think he's actually playing a game, but he is responsible for all these transitions here on the screen, and so I had to convince him not to do some cool transitions, but we're there. So how do we innovate? And we by large companies. The fact that I love about the academic world that I appreciated more when I left is, and I did a lot of psychology, is you get these incredibly complicated models of the world, of like there are 10 different types of innovation, 12 different types of innovation, it doesn't matter, you can look it up. The fact of the matter is that is almost impossible to implement in a large company. I have never in my life gone into a presentation where I'm asking for money, because that is part of the process, and said, I have ticked all 4 or 12 boxes of innovation, or Porter's 5 forces. That just does not work. Most people in the world can only hold on to a couple things in their head. And so what you effectively talk about is product and service. That's the only 2 ways to differentiate. Well, how is the product different? How am I delivering it different? And so it's important to understand, I don't want to denigrate the academic world because I do benefit from it. It is important to understand how you're innovating, what you're changing, etc. But that's really all you're touching in the real world. How is my product different and how is my service different? It used to matter how your location was different. Am I doing it in this place or that place? But what the internet has done is it's really gotten rid of sort of location as a constraint. You can now launch the entire country, you can launch the entire planet. When I used to work at Procter & Gamble, and this was very exciting, we were launching a new type of diaper, and effectively, I remember sitting in meetings and saying, well, how are we going to roll this out? Well, we'll start with Cincinnati, and then we can get the trucks over here, and then we can get over there, and we'll buy media just for this place. And it was very much a campaign of like the logistics of it. That has sort of gone away. Now you do whole region, whole globe launches. Language and rules are more of a limitation. So really, location is not as critical, but still product and service are the important matters. And so when you, assuming some of you end up working in large companies, when you are pitching, when you are trying to get money for a project, it doesn't matter where you are in the company, you always have to ask somebody for money. There is never enough money to do what you want to do. You basically said, this is how the product is different, this is how the service is different, ideally both, and this is how they both meet this customer need which we've identified that no one has before. And I'll talk about starting with needs in a second, but really, what did Netflix do with streaming? They determined that people wanted to hang out and chill at home, they wanted to watch movies, they did not want to go to watch a shop. How do I then deliver that product to them? The technology facilitated it, but it was not the technology that drove the decision. It was the consumer need and the business model. I have a saying I tell my team is, you really have to understand where people are. It's very hard to bring people to a new place. So, do any of you not smoke? There's a question. Yes, many of you don't. I don't smoke, don't worry. Many of you don't smoke, right? Okay, how much would I have to pay you or change you to smoke? Almost impossible. And that is the reality of the world. People rarely change their behaviors. Okay? And as you guys get older and you hang out with your roommates 20 or 30 years ago, and I just had a chance to meet a floor mate this morning from breakfast, she is exactly the same. She is the same person, she's joking, she hasn't changed. It's been like 30 years, she's a tenured professor or whatever, it doesn't matter. And so what you will find is that that applies also to innovating in a large company in the market. The market is a certain way. They may have needs, but they're undiscovered. You are not creating a new needs. People always wanted to be lazy and hang out on the sofa and watch TV, whatever they wanted, and they wanted that choice. It wasn't that Netflix created that space. Hell, there was BitTorrent before that. People were stealing stuff anyway. It was really about finding that and marketing to that need. And so the key success factor then, if it's not about the academic model, if it's not about the technology, it's about the need, it's about the business model. How are you going to deliver this product? And this is the question that we spend time over and over in large companies. And so, how are we going to deliver? I will talk about diapers a little more because it's kind of funny and because it's been 30 years at Procter & Gamble, so it's no longer privileged information. But we did a study at P&G, which was then called the current best approach, as they used to refer to it. They called it the current best approach because they wanted to make sure that you were always trying to find a new approach. And what we determined at the time was that people who had babies in diapers try new diapers when their diaper failed. This was what you found in the market. A mother and a father were changing diapers, and a parent, whatever, and then, it got a little messy. The question was, it must have been the diaper, let me try another one. Well, the reason was that babies don't go small, medium, large. They're on a curve. And so Procter & Gamble at the time said we're going to have something called phases. It was like 7 or 9 sizes. I can't quite remember. But the implementation and the rollout of the business model was super important. And so it wasn't enough to say, here are 7 sizes. Parents were busy then. One more thing to worry about. It was a question of how you delivered it on the shelf. And so how did you lay it out for all the sizes? How did you manage the out of stocks? How did you communicate it? How do you talk to the trade, the supermarket? That's what really made the success of the product. And eventually, for those of you who have younger siblings or cousins or friends who have babies, that's all gone away because the business model did not work. It was too complex for the trade. There's pretty much diapers are back to small, medium, large right now. And so the reality is, as exciting it is to talk about diapers or nappies, for those of us who live in the UK and other parts of the world, it was really about getting the business model right. And that applies to everything. And so when you think of iTunes and all these other great things, or even Harvard has a fantastic business model, right? It has a reputation that draws people in. It has tens of thousands of applicants. When you come here, you're pretty much staying for 4 years, right? So they don't have to really keep you that entertained throughout the process. And then once you've left, it's in your self-interest to promote it because it has a fantastic name and that draws your future. So that business model is self-perpetuating, and which is why it is difficult for new universities to build that same reputation. So the business model is important. The education, the product, the service clearly are strong too, but it's really the business model that drives it. And so this is the question that we ask, and the last part is important. How do we bring this product to market profitably, at scale, without destroying the organization? And profitably, everybody sort of understands in the pre-revenue model, people talk about that profit's not important or not. Profits are important. Revenue is important. You have to make money. That's the whole point of the capitalist system. People are investing to get returns. They may not get any returns in the short term, but they're going to get it ready in the long term. Amazon lost money, I think, for 10 or 15 years before they made money, but there was always the vision there that would deliver the revenue. At scale means it can't be a hobby. It has to grow. It has to be a large market segment. And then without destroying the organization. Organizations are difficult to build and maintain. There is a lot of pressure on organizations. When you look at startup companies, and I work with a few startup companies giving advice and such, I used to foolishly say things like, well, let me talk to your chief product officer. And they're like, oh, you're speaking to them. I'm like, okay, you're the CEO, the product officer, the finance officer, yes. And so there's not that depth of organization. So if somebody's committed, they can get it out the door at a small group, 20, 40 people, there's a lot of interaction. When you get to large companies, there is resilience. There are different people who can do that. But having built that company over time and built a pipeline and the knowledge that is inherent in that is difficult to maintain. And dramatic change makes it difficult for organizations to move forward. And so this is why you hear over and over again of culture being important. It's because the organization's going in a certain way and you have to sort of maintain it in that direction. It's very, very difficult to shift directions. And when a company is successful, it's almost impossible to shift direction. Really, only people are willing to try something new when they're failing. And so back to how human behavior, it has to be consistent with the current company. So how do you innovate in that environment? How do you get around that? So it all boils down to this. Adjustment more than creation is the typical innovation in large companies. And it is the typical creation in the world. I tell people, if I can get this clicky thing to work, Gabriel, we're going to have a conversation. No. Yeah. It's a great presentation, let me tell you guys. Something's wrong here. Okay, hold on. I think we missed something here. Or maybe I just have to wait. Can you see this? All right. We'll have to figure out this slide in a second. But we'll go back to it. Everything around us was technology at some point. Wall-to-wall wood, wall-to-wall carpeting, amphitheaters. You have to go back to Roman time, but this was all technology. We just ignore it. Stained glass windows. Everything was technology. And so that was a function of large companies, if you go back far enough in time, family-owned companies, of making adjustments and changes. That is 95% of the innovation that happens in companies. How do I deliver this floor more cheaply? How do I deliver it, more sturdy? How do I drive it around the country? That is the majority of innovation that happens in the world, and that is the majority of innovation that happens in companies. It's not always super exciting, but it is a reality of what happens in the world, and it is something that drives careers and does pay well. So you have to find that balance. But really, that is the innovation that we look for. And these adjustments, as I refer to them, are more likely to be scalable. If I'm delivering floor today and I need to stick these planks together before I deliver them here, okay, I can change. I have a process. I have a delivery process. I have the wood already. I can scale that. It's more likely to be profitable because I'm looking to do this more efficiently. And it's more likely that the organization is going to accept it because they say to themselves, yeah, we used to deliver individual planks of wood, now we deliver them in sections of 5 or 10. If anybody has done any tile work in this company, in this world, they used to have individual little tiles like a mosaic. Now they come pre-stuck on a background and you do whole sections at a time. That is incredibly profitable and successful for companies. And that adjustment, which is, back to our dear friend Thomas Edison's perspiration rather than inspiration, is what drives growth over and over again. It doesn't sound really exciting, but let me tell you, companies are doing that every day and looking for a better way to do it, and very excited about that. So, we're going to go back to this and we'll see if this works. Play. Trying to get to the next page. Okay, so what does a business model do? In these companies. How do they work? Because I think this is important to understand. Effectively, they leverage the innate scale of large companies. There are many departments versus individuals responsible to drive, market-facing innovation. There's product departments, there's marketing department, there's sales. And as I mentioned, they're really focused, if I can get this, on the market need. What do people want more of? This is why large companies innovate better if you're looking surely at the number of innovations and the scale of innovations than small companies. Because it's not one person with an idea, because one person with an idea can be wrong. It's a group of individuals getting reinforcement and questions and driving that scale across multiple departments to find a better answer in terms of market need. And so this is what, if you're in these departments, this is your job. How do I figure out what the consumer wants or my customer wants, and how do I drive that growth? And so when I look at I'll talk about Citibank. When I talked about how do I get people insurance, I tried to figure out what sort of insurance they needed or wanted. And so just looking through the data, one of the things that we realized early on is that people in developing countries mostly wanted educational insurance when they had young children. And so this sounds like obvious in retrospect. But before, you were just selling insurance to everybody. Now we're like, oh, you have a young child, let me pay for it now. So not necessarily when they were 15 or 17, when they were born, when they were thinking about the child's future. That's what the data showed. That's what the need was. That's how you drove innovation in the large company. And then you have other departments where innovation is just part of delivering shareholder value. How do I get stuff done more cheaply, faster, and quicker? And this is sort of I have no idea what's going on here, and I apologize. of course, worked in the hotel. Cost efficient, better, faster, cheaper. Those things are really part and part innovation. So if you end up working in operations, finance, and HR, every year it's like do the same thing, but do it with 2 to 5 to 7% less money. And that's innovation. The reason I talk about this as innovation, cost savings and the such, is because if you want to do something different, this is the #1 way to get it approved. If you go to a finance officer and you say, I need $5 million and I can make 20 or 50 million bucks, what every CFO on the planet will tell you is, throw it on the pile with the other 5 million dollar ideas, and we'll get to it when we can. Because there is no shortage of $5 million ideas. If you come with a $50 million idea, that gets a little attention. There are a shortage of $50 million ideas. But $5 million ideas are all over the place, and they throw them on the pile. But if you say, give me $5 million and I'll save you $20 million, that goes straight to the top. Okay, because then people are like, I believe that. And so when you're trying to make a large change, that is the way to do it. At MasterCard, I was responsible for, the T, SEPTA, the transit systems of you paying with your card, et cetera. That was pitched as a savings. It was like, this is so much cheaper than the current systems, and that's why it got ahead. And so that really is the way to pitch significant changes. I bet you, although I wasn't there, when NetStream pitched streaming versus mailing CDs, it was a cost savings method. CDs won't get broken, we don't have to mail them, et cetera. So my other bit of advice, and I think this also works for startups, because at least it biases me. When I sit down with a company and they're like, we're going to do this, and we'll save this money along the way, and then we're going to change the world over here, that saving the money along the way makes it credible. Makes it sort of, okay, well, you're getting rid of a middleman, or you're delivering this more efficiently, or, here was somebody had to do this, now they have to do that. Savings of money and time is what makes it believable, because not only is it an understanding of how do you save money, it's an understanding of what the market wants. And so you can't simply say, I have a business model where I have 20 people covering 20 customers and say, I'm going to get rid of 5 of them and I'm going to save money, because that's not what the customer wants. But if you come to them and say, 5 people can do something else because we're going to group these 2 customers together, or we're going to move someone to this other place where they're closer to 2 customers, then it's sort of believable. And so extraordinarily important to drive that efficiency in the conversations. This is going to go a lot faster now because I won't be able to build. So when we talk about the chain reaction that gets innovation going, you start with, what is the unmet market need? This is, I've mentioned a couple times, that is really important. How large companies do this is they build separate units. And so I know Ken from Labs was here at MasterCard. He talks about how they specifically focus on growth. The old term for it is skunk works. You build a separate group that effectively sole focus on this. This is really, really important, because if your job is to build TV sets, it's very hard to envision another new TV set, or not the need for a TV set, because you're too emotionally invested in it. So find the customer need, separate groups to do that. Start with the cost savings, as I've mentioned before. It's always the goal of the CFO. This is probably the #2 thing, new customers and cost savings. This is really what drives innovation everywhere. And when you talk to partners, it's the same sort of thing. Let me tell you about how I'm going to save you money to start, because that is believable. Leverage existing technology and product as much as possible. This is difficult for most of my young hires to understand, because they've seen technology change the world. But the technology has changed, but it's really the delivery of the technology, right? We had computers, you just didn't carry them in your pocket, right? You had TV and a screen and the movies, you just had to go somewhere else for them. It was really the delivery. It wasn't the technology per se. The technology per se facilitated to meet the customer need, but it was really about a business model where you can make a supercomputer and keep it in your pocket at a price that people are willing to pay. That business model is important. You have to show an ongoing path to the organization. A one-trick pony is not a career, okay? And so you have to deliver that vision up front. We are going to make phones, or what was it, if we'll take Apple, which some of us remember, or Google, You have phones, they're allowed to communicate. One day they'll do video, one day they'll do maps, one day they'll do movies, one day they'll do God knows what, teleportation or virtual visits, in a holographic center. That vision is being worked on and delivered, and it tells people that it doesn't stop here. And that is what really drives the business. It's not just about what I'm doing now, it's what I'm doing the next 2 to 5 years. And why? Because if you're a large company, the stock market underappreciates one-time events. If you make a lot of money, your stock price doesn't change a lot. If you lose a lot of money in one particular thing, your stock price doesn't change so much. It looks for a flow. And so that long-term flow is what is really important for the company to drive forward. And then the other thing is try to avoid cannibalization. People are afraid of losing their jobs, right? It's at the core of everyone. They're feeding their families, themselves, they're going on trips, whatever. And so if you come to the organization and you say, and if I came to Paul and said, hey, I have this great idea where Dr. Ricketts doesn't need to be here anymore. Sorry, I'm picking on you because I can't make fun of anybody else here. Paul might be like, that's a great idea. But Dr. Ricketts is going to say, yeah, that's really interesting, and work his darnest to avoid it happening. That is what actually happens in large companies. That somebody is like, you're going to make a instant camera that does digital film. All the camera people doing film were like, well, we don't want that to work necessarily. Here's everything that's wrong with it. This reinforces back the name for labs. But it's really about that stable organization and moving it forward. We'll see how this works here. So, what are the limitations of large companies to a certain extent? And like everything, there's a pro and con. There is a lot. So, number one, it's really hard to tell the future. It's not very clear the way things are going. The AI, chat GPT stuff caught the markets by surprise. I don't care what people say. I didn't see people working at it immediately the next day, and now every damn pitch I look at has the word AI in it. And so for a while, every pitch had blockchain in it, and before that, I can't remember what it was, but these things go through fashions. And so AI is the current fashion. It catches people by surprise. But it is unclear what's gonna happen, and so this is why large companies don't see it coming. If you look at Airbnb, that came up, or taxi companies when Uber came up, they were surprised. They were caught off guard. Now, for those of you who don't know, Marriott and other large companies today will offer you homes as part of their package of goods. They also have, you go to their website, oh, you don't want to stay at a hotel? We have 15 different brands, so we're providing you variety. Here's also some homes that are part of our network and are Marriott certified. And so there are adaptations there, but the future isn't always obvious. You can't cut your way to greatness, okay? You want to grow the pie, and if you just keep cutting expenses, that does not actually work. It doesn't bring in new customers, it doesn't bring revenue, it doesn't really drive the business. How is the next great thing done? This is a little bit of, you can't quite know what's going to happen, but there's a tendency in large companies to optimize failure and optimize success. Sometimes optimizing failure is more common. We got this going, we're going to keep going at it. And it's hard for me in a video recorded scenario talk about companies that have done this recently, but you all know that there are companies out there who are still pumping, let's say, non-healthy foods, et cetera, because, that's what our market wants, and certain markets want that, but it really is a challenge, and you get a lot of optimization of failure. And then standalone innovation units are difficult to sustain over time. This is, most skunkworks historically were temporary situations, so were labs. And that was a function of are they just a cost or not driving revenue, or they invented something and it failed. And so that creates a lot of success, which is why for a functioning economy and market and society, having people challenge, having startups come up and point out different ways is very important to the overall development. And what happens in many cases is that they get bought out or the idea gets co-opted, but that ability to create outside actually drives a lot of value. And then cannibalization is not a concern for the competition. There's an old story of AT&T. I think AT&T is still around. It's changed a lot. AT&T got into banking at one point. Many of you may not remember this. Coca-Cola got into clothing. So, there's a lot of strange things that have happened in the past. I had this beautiful Coke shirt in the 1970s, I think. And so what happened is that AT&T got into banking, and it changed the pricing. Before, banks were charging a lot. Somebody came in and said, you guys are making 5%, I'm only making 1% in my core business, I'm happy making 3%, and they changed the market, and they came in, and a big part of the reason why banking is so cutthroat today in terms of 0% back-on offers, which many people benefit from, and free checking and free savings, was because somebody from the outside came in and basically said, there's a better way to do this. So yeah, cannibalization is not a concern. I'm going to do something crazy here. I'm going to try to go back to the transitions. I have no idea what happened. But yeah, whatever. Okay, so we'll give up on that. So what does a company do in order to get out the door and minimize the risk and to minimize career risk? There's a risk of losing money. That's happened to me plenty of times. As long as you make more money than you lose, that's okay. It's really a diversity approach. But one of the questions is that you're almost always convinced of, hey, this is the right way to do this. And especially well-educated people, we tend to have a little bit of a bias about ourselves in terms of our ability to do things right or not. The reality is, like everybody else, we're figuring it out as we go along, but there tends to be more of a bias because you're successful academically, it got you here, so okay, well maybe this is right most of the time. When you get a partner, what you're doing is minimizing the risk. Somebody else is validating the new market opportunity to make sure it's profitable. It's not just your company. You're like, I had this idea, we'll pick on transit again, that you don't need to get your own separate card or your little token, or they used to have little metal coins on transit, you can pay with a card. And people are like, that's crazy. Why, this Oyster system in the UK is the greatest thing on the planet. Why would you want something differently? Or Octopus in Hong Kong or wherever. And then you go talk to somebody else and they're like, that actually solves the problem of ours, that these things are expensive and difficult to maintain. And I don't want to produce a new plastic. We'll have somebody else do that. And so that validation in the market is really important. Now, the important thing here is you don't do this with startups. Sorry. It's not that I don't like startups. It's that sometimes I don't like startups. You have to do this with captains of industry. Large companies know and understand their market. They are the people you want to leverage. You don't want to leverage the new person. You want to leverage the people who have been there and run the business. They have the connectivity. They have the network. They have the ability to get things done. That is extraordinarily important to get right. 2 people, more resources. Speed of execution is a lot faster, particularly when you're entering a new segment in the industry. There are people there. You just have discovered a need, scale. And then it minimizes your career risk organization. It's funny, but people want to succeed in their careers, and if you switch companies too often, it's difficult to succeed. But when you build a partnership, not only do you have a chance to go another way, you're building a network, you're looking for other industries, you also are 2 of you coming together, and once again, it's not Carlos who is wrong, it's the group of people that Carlos plus this other company we're looking at, although Carlos is wrong plenty, about how you're driving forward the idea. And so that even when you're wrong, you get a sense of that the right things were being done. And so partnerships are very, very valuable. Citibank, and we went into partnerships with co-brands. That's what I did at Citibank out of Delaware in the MBNA model, finding partners there. At MasterCard, my job was to find partners in transit, in health, in insurance, in B2B trade. It was all about figuring a path forward. And so when we were talking about health, and you're like, oh, we're having health people here together, I was like, oh, yes, well, I know a bunch of people in health. How do we drive that forward? And the network is really, really important. What you will find, and I think Dr. Ricketts told me, is that for the rest of your life, you're going to be hanging out with the people you met at Harvard. Or the people that you didn't meet at Harvard, but know because you went to the same school and have that connectivity and that trust. And so when these partnerships are built upon trust, and when you're looking for individuals, the network is very, very important. When you go to school, you have to do certain things to get a grade, to graduate, and there's a very set out path, and that's clear. But when you start that career, it's about, well, how do I make a difference? How do I do something different? And part of it is, how smart you are and what you do and how hard you work. But a lot of it is, who do you know and how do you build that network? And that's really, really important. And so just something to keep in mind, because I'll be talking about it a little later. Let me see if I can get this to work. So how do we work on partners? Because there is actually, I've met a lot of partners along the way, particularly in my last job. So what I did at MasterCard until recently is I did pricing for the last 7 years. I did large account management, so Airbnb, Shopify, HSBC, Revolut, et cetera. And I did innovation with large companies. And you got better at it with practice, like everything else. So the first thing you have to do is understand who you are. Who you are at the most fundamental. You know, is it reach? Is it funding? Is it text flexibility? And so in MasterCard's case, and I'll use this, MasterCard is global. Now people are like, oh yeah, there are a lot of companies that are global. Coca-Cola, for instance, is globally located. They're not global. They have bottlers around the world. They're independently owned. They have, they have a global brand, a global marketing, but they're not run the same. It's not one system. Pizza Hut, the same sort of thing. There's ownership fractions. MasterCard is truly global. So if I want to do something in Antarctica, maybe not a great choice, but Antarctica and Canada and Nepal, I can do one project, one technology stack, one way forward, and probably find some partners that work in most of those markets already. So MasterCard is global. It's safe. You don't worry about whether the money gets there. It's quick. It's marginally cost delivered. There's a bunch of different things, and you boil this down. And so when you guys are pitching in a large company or you're pitching in a startup, what do you have? Okay? What do you have? The business model is part of that, but what do you have? Then you go, and that last point is important. It doesn't mean you're the only one with this skill set, right? It just means that you understand what you can do. Then you go and you start figuring out, okay, well, what's the industry look like? Where else can I bring global to? Who else is trying to go global? And so you start researching industries. You go visit conventions. You read industry manuals. There's a lot of research. There's nothing worse than showing up to a meeting and saying, hey, I'm here to talk about wood floors, and not know anything about wood floors. There is an immense amount of preparation in innovation. It is not an insight. It is doing your homework and being ready. And that is the other big success factor. You have to be ready. You always have to be prepared, because that is what makes a difference. Harvard will get you through the door. Your history and your contacts will say, all right, I think this is going to work, but you have to know your shit and you have to be ready. And so very, very important to be ready. And that's not just ready with your own stuff, ready with the people you want to partner with. Then you go talk to the people. You haven't actually spoken to a lot of people in this. Then you actually go knock on people's doors and say, hi, I'm Carlos Menendez. I have an idea. I want to talk to you. And let's get together and meet. This is important to understand, not just the industry, but the rising competitors. People are afraid of rising competitors because maybe they won't take over the company, but they can impact your profit margins, which impacts your stock price multiple, which puts your career at risk, tying that all together. So they want to know. So you come. So you know what you can do. You know what the opportunity is, and you start meeting with people. Then you start at the top. You cannot innovate with a partner by working your way up. It's not going to happen, okay? There's a shortage of money, as I said, and money decisions and retransferring assets can only be done at the top. Now, if you happen to know somebody who's in an organization, that's great. Can you introduce me to your boss's boss? That's generally how far favors can go. And you just sort of work your way up. But you can't actually make a decision or pitch until you're starting at the C-suite. That's just the way things are. Then you meet in person and you say, talk to me about what you want to do and what worries you. And usually out of that, something comes out. And you get better at this over time. You're like, oh, you are worried about regulatory threat. I understand. Well, in this market, I saw this, or I know this company, and you figure out how you can help them because you want to build that trust. I once had a partner tell me, Carlos, I'm just one more partner for you, but I'm betting my career on you for this working. And so it's important that you're building value for them. And so that's why, this is unusual, but 50-50 split up front. There's too much time dividing zero. I'm a bigger company. It was my idea. Forget that. You'll never get it out the door. And it's not that somebody's doing more than others. That happens throughout life. It happens throughout relationships. It's just part of the world. The reality is that if you're trying to build trust, people think you're taking advantage. And so if you're not agreeing to equality from the beginning, it's really a problem. And so the second thing is that, and this is very important in large companies versus small companies, if you have a startup, and I have friends who've had startups for 10, 12 years, so, it's a side gig, they're trying, they're going to keep trying, nothing wrong with that. Some of them do succeed, but speed is your friend in large companies. The turnover in large companies is immense, and you don't want a product and a project that takes a year plus to get off the ground. It just won't happen. It has to be quick. And then finally, different from a startup, you actually have to put points on the board up front. It proves the company works together and it builds trust. And so you can't say, I have this great idea to make flooring and 7 years from now, we're going to take over the world. Yeah, not going to work. 7 years is a long time. It has to be, we're going to do this first. First thing we're going to do is going to make these floors look better after 40 years. I don't think they've changed these in a long time. But that is really the way things work. Set that vision. 7 to 10 year contracts are possible. And then this is all about execution. And this is the interesting thing, right? People talk about innovation as if you wake up in the middle of the night and have an idea. That's part of it, but ideas are cheap. It's really about the execution. You have to leverage the existing organization in Salesforce. You cannot retrain sales forces. I have managed sales forces of 40,000 people, okay? You cannot simply say in the morning, hey, you were selling credit cards. Tomorrow, guess what? We're selling floors. It doesn't happen. Even close by, we're selling mortgages. We're selling insurance. It doesn't work that way. You have to figure out how you say, hey, we're now selling credit cards or something similar to governments rather than individuals. You have to find that shift, and you have to leverage the sales force. You may eventually want to be selling new products, but that doesn't happen right away because, once again, you go to the sales force, and they're worried about their careers, they're worried about their jobs, they're worried about their organization. Most sales forces are on variable comp, which means if they don't sell, they don't make any money. And so when you get to them and you say, I have this brand new idea, the first thing they think is, oh my God, how am I going to pay my rent, my mortgage, whatever? And so you really have to bring the organization along, and what you do is you leverage existing Salesforce abilities and contexts. You can't teach new things right away. And the overall goal is to increase speed of execution in these partnerships. The faster, the better. Your CEO, if you're not the CEO, is going to stand up on stage and say, hey, we have this great idea, and we're going to launch it. And except for COVID in the way, a couple more things would have been launched. And so you can't really be in a position where things take too long because your performance review comes at the end of the year and the market is expecting it and you want to show progress. So speed is your friend in these large companies. So I think those are most of the points I wanted to make on innovation in large companies. It's really about the implementation. It's about the perspiration. It's how you bring people along with you and how you do it in a profitable and scalable way. Startups have another path. Startups are great. They have a place too, and between the two of them, you get the most innovation. But it is important to drive companies forward, and that tends to happen more in large companies, which is why you have seen over the last 5 years these partnerships between startups and banks. What's happened in Australia, for example, which was very familiar with fintechs and the such, is that all the fintechs are pretty much gone. They've been absorbed by the large banks. And so the ideas have continued, but they've been absorbed in large banks. So this ability to innovate in a large company can be helpful in the sense of, for you, even if you start in a startup, because, dollars to donuts, as they used to say, you're going to end up working in a large company or innovating with a large company. It's important to understand their motivations. Dr. Ricketts, I can't see where he's gone, but whatever, he said, you have to give them some career advice. I'll tell you honestly, when I was your age, I'm not sure I was listening to career advice, but I'll give you my 2 cents, although there are many paths. Oh, there you are. I think the first thing is you have to figure out what you want and what you're actually good at. And this sounds obvious, maybe sounds more obvious after I brought it up in terms of partnerships, but the figuring out what you are good at or getting good at something is important. No large company is ever given to a young individual with no ability. And you can't start off being a generalist. I interview a lot of people and they say, oh, I want to run a division. Excellent. Have you done sales? No. Have you done operations? No. Have you done technology? No. Have you done HR? Have you done regulatory support? Have you done finance? No. Okay. Well, you have to get good at that. You have to get good at something so that you can build on that. And so you can build your network and you build it out. And so it is really, really important to get good at something, okay? Learn to be a good manager early on. I was telling Jordan, it's easy to be a good manager when you have 4 or 5 people and they're like, oh, I'm the team president, whatever, I have a club of 12 people or whatever. The beauty of having 12 people report to you is that when something goes wrong, you can actually sit there and say, let's work it out together. When you have several thousand people reporting to you, that is impossible. So it's really how to become a manager of managers. And a manager of managers, you have to start by becoming a good manager and a good follower, understanding what that means. So spend a lot of time being good at something and being a good manager. Once you have that specialty, you can become a generalist. And so my view on this, which I haven't seen in any book, but smaller, broader jobs are better than larger, narrow jobs. And so when I was at Citibank and I went to run Spain and Portugal, where I was running the whole business, that was nothing in revenue at the time. But the other option was to go run strategy globally for Citibank. And I was like, what do I do after a strategy job? And so when I looked around and I said, who are the regional presidents? How did they get there? They all started with country managers. So it was a smaller job. And I remember a boss at my time saying, Carlos, if you go to Europe, you'll never come back. Turned out to be true, but whatever. And so I think the reality is go as broad as you can early on. Take on as much responsibility, raise your hand, do whatever you're willing to do so that you figure stuff out. There used to be a time when all CEOs needed to go through sales. You probably need to go through technology now. So that's changed a little bit on the advice, just because there's a lot of sales specialists, there are better sales tools, and there's more information. You need to be successful, right? But more than to be successful, your impact has to be clearly seen. And this also, once again, works in smaller groups. When you go to a large, and you can learn this at a large company. You don't have to work at a small company. You're one of 200 summer interns. Worked on a project, launched a rocket, great job. How was your impact determined? Because that is really what matters. And so you have to do this without annoying people, right? This is not about, just sucking up. It's figuring out how you get responsibility over something that matters. Maybe it's not the whole rocket, but it has to be a critical part. And so that is really important. Part of that is really about sticking close to revenue and customers. If you want to be at the top of a company, it's about new customers, it's about new growth. That applies to non-innovation jobs too. So stick closer to revenue and customers. It is very hard to run a company if you start in human resources, as an example. It's just not considered, it's a little bit obvious, but it's not just considered the future of the company. And then there's a question on AI and impact of all of this. God knows, and maybe it's just the buzzword of the time, but what I will tell you over and over again is it's important to build that network. As I look at the next role for myself, and I still have a lot of contacts and time with MasterCard, it's that network and people I have met and continue to reach out to that will determine what the next thing I do. Whether I'm going to get on a board because I need a board with your skill set, this person reaches out, or whether you're going to make an investment together with somebody, or whether you're going to go work in a particular company, it's about that network. So build that network. I am inherently an introvert, which people find difficult to believe now, but it's probably slowed me down in my life, and so I have worked harder at reaching out to people and building relationships, and that really makes a difference because these are the individuals you're going to be around with for the rest of your life. With that, I have time for questions and a beautiful, I don't know what, but happy to answer any questions, thoughts. I'm also on LinkedIn. I will respond to every email. That's a promise I make everybody. I do eventually get there. Sometimes it takes me a month or so, but happy to.
6 months?
That was just you, Dr. Ricketts.
Okay, that's just me. All right, great. Carlos, thank you so
Dr.
much
Ricketts. A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.